A girl carries a silver tray down a corridor of stone, her hands shaking, so badly the cutlery rattles like a small bell tolling for her. At the end of that corridor, an iron door is leaking heat that has no business existing inside a castle cold enough to see your own breath. Behind her, the laughter of the court ladies fades. Nobody follows. Nobody ever does. 3 girls have carried a tray past that threshold this month. Not one walked back out on her own feet. The torch on the wall gutters sideways. The floor shudders once, faint, slow, as though something underneath it has just turned over in its sleep. The camera pushes in close. Sweat. A clenched jaw. Eyes that refuse to look up. 3 iron bolts are drawn back, one after another. The door cracks open. The darkness inside doesn't behave like darkness. It breathes. And a low, guttural snarl rolls out of it, the instant her foot crosses the threshold. She had no family. No friends. No one. That was the first thing the court women learned about her. And the first thing they used against her. Because the palace ran on cruelty the way a hearth runs on wood. Feed it something. Anything. Or it goes cold. And cold, in that place, was worse than dying. Today, they fed it Issa. The lower kitchen smelled like rendered fat, and burnt sugar, and something underneath that, something sour, something that never quite washed out of the stone no matter how many girls scrubbed it on their knees. Lady Odessa stood at the counter, with her arms crossed, the silver tray in front of her gleaming under the low firelight. Roasted meat. Spiced wine. Gravy going cold in its little silver boat. A meal fit for a king. Which was the joke? Because everyone in that kitchen knew what happened to the last meal fit for a king. Take it up, orphan. Odessa's voice cracked through the room like a whip made of silk. Unless, of course, you're too much of a coward to serve your own king. Laughter. Sharp. Brittle. The kind that bounces off stone, and comes back uglier than it left. Issa kept her eyes on the floor. Because looking up meant seeing their faces. And their faces meant seeing the enjoyment. And the enjoyment was the part she couldn't stomach. Not the cruelty itself. She'd made peace with cruelty a long time ago. It was the pleasure in it that still cut. Let's see if this little mouse lasts longer than the others, another voice chimed in. A fan snapped open. Hid a smirk behind lace and silk. They had to drag the last one out by her ankles. Issa's fingers tightened on her apron. 3 maids. 3, in the last month alone. Sent into King Kailyn's chambers, with a tray, and a prayer. None of them walked out on their own feet. The whispers said blood on the stone. Furniture in splinters. A king who had lost the war against his own mind, and was now just waiting. Waiting to lose it completely. Waiting for the last thread to snap. And they were sending her in, with a plate of roast lamb. Right away, my lady. Her voice barely made it past her own teeth. She lifted the tray. Heavier than it looked. Or maybe that was just her arms, already trembling before she'd taken a single step. She turned toward the door, and the laughter followed her out, into the corridor, thin and mocking, a flock of birds picking at something already half dead. The hallway got colder with every step. That was the thing nobody told you about the royal wing. Not the danger. Not the guards. The cold. It came up, through the stone floor like the castle itself was trying to warn you. Turn back. Turn back. Turn back. She didn't turn back. Couldn't. Because refusing a direct order from nobility meant one thing. Banishment. Out past the walls. Into the frozen wastes, where the wolves, that weren't men anymore ran in packs, and didn't care whose blood they spilled. At least dying inside the castle came, with a roof, over her head. Small mercies. That's what her mother used to call them. Small mercies, Issa. That's all this world hands out to people like us. Learn to be grateful for them. Her mother had been dead 6 years. And Issa still hadn't learned. 2 guards stood outside the king's chamber. Massive iron doors behind them, reinforced with bands of dark metal, that looked less like decoration, and more like a promise. The older guard, Captain Bren, looked at her the way you'd look at a lamb walking itself to slaughter. They sent you? His eyes moved over her. Slight frame. Faded gray uniform. Nothing about her said soldier, or healer, or anyone who belonged, within 100 feet of this door. You're just a girl. The court ladies requested I bring his evening meal, sir. Bren's jaw worked. Something passed behind his eyes. Pity, maybe. Or guilt. Hard to tell the difference on a face that tired. Listen to me. He leaned in. Voice dropped low, urgent. If he lunges, you drop the tray. You run. You don't look back. You don't try to save the tray, the dishes, none of it. You run. Issa nodded. Because there wasn't anything else to say. The guards didn't open the door normally. There was nothing normal about anything past this point. They unbolted it, 3 heavy iron bars, one after another, each one groaning, through the corridor like something dying slow. Then they cracked it open. Just wide enough. Go, Bren said. Quiet. Almost gentle. She went. And the door shut behind her. Darkness swallowed her whole. Not the ordinary kind. Not the kind you get used to, after a minute. This was thick. Pressing. It had weight, this darkness, and it pushed against her chest, until breathing felt like a decision instead of a reflex. The air was hot. Too hot. It smelled like sweat, and copper and something else underneath, something that made every instinct in her body scream at once. Drop to your knees. Drop to your knees. Drop to your knees. That was her Omega side talking. The part of her she usually kept locked down tight, buried under years of discipline, and hunger and the simple fact that survival left no room for softness. But this alpha pressure. It was different than anything she'd felt before. It was drowning. Then the sound came. A snarl. Low. Guttural. It didn't come from a throat, so much as it came from somewhere underneath the floorboards, vibrating up through the soles of her shoes, and into her spine. Issa's heart slammed against her ribs. Because this was it. This was the moment Bren warned her about. Drop the tray. Run. Except her legs didn't move. Her eyes adjusted, slow, agonizing, to the thin moonlight bleeding through the high arched windows. And what she saw made every nerve in her body go still. King Kailyn. Massive against the far wall. Chest bare. Skin gleaming with sweat, marked with old scars, that told stories no healer had ever gotten to hear. His wrists were bound. Thick iron chains, forged with silver, bolted straight into the stone. Pulled taut. He was fighting them. His whole body strained against the metal, and the chains rattled, and threw sparks against the dark rock, and he did not look like a king. He looked like something that used to be a man. She braced. For pain. For the end. His head snapped toward her. Jagged. Fast. Wrong, somehow, the way a puppet moves, when the strings are cut halfway through. Through the tangle of dark hair, his eyes glowed amber. Bright. Blind. Hunting for her without seeing her. His nostrils flared. And then nothing. The chains went still. Issa didn't breathe. Couldn't. Because the pressure that had been crushing the air out of the room was gone. Like someone had opened a window in the middle of a storm, and let all the wind out at once. Kailyn's eyes cleared. Amber bled into hazel. Slow. Like watching a fire burn down to embers. And underneath the madness, underneath all of it, there was a man. Exhausted. Hollowed out. Looking at her the way a drowning man looks at the first piece of driftwood he's seen in months. Mine. The word rolled out of him low. Rough. Not a command. Not a threat. A confession. It landed somewhere in her chest, and stayed there, and she had no idea what to do with it, no idea what any of this meant, because she was nobody. A servant. An omega with no name, that mattered, and no family to protect her, and absolutely nothing that should make an alpha king go this still. He didn't lunge. He didn't strain against the chains anymore. He just watched her. Chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths, like he was trying to memorize the shape of the air she'd brought in with her. Every instinct told her to run. She didn't. Instead, and she would spend the rest of her life not fully understanding why, she took a step forward. Then another. Crossed the invisible line, where safety ended, and everything else began. Set the tray down on a side table, hands shaking so badly the silverware clinked against the porcelain like tiny bells. He didn't flinch at the sound. Didn't even look at the food. He looked at her. She walked until she was close enough to feel the heat radiating off his skin, close enough that, if he wanted to end her, he wouldn't even have to try. He didn't move. He tilted his head down. Just slightly. Let out a long, ragged breath, and something in his face, something that had been clenched tight for longer than she could imagine, loosened. For the first time in months, King Kailyn wasn't fighting anymore. He was just breathing her in. She woke up the next morning clutching her blanket like it owed her an explanation. Heart hammering before her eyes even opened. The little servant's room around her felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too normal, after a night like that. Did it happen? The dark. The chains. The word. Mine. She looked at her own hands. Steady now, but she remembered them shaking. Remembered the tray. Remembered his eyes. Surely she'd fainted. Surely the guards carried her back, and her mind had built the rest, into something softer than the truth, because that's what minds do, when the truth is too much to hold. Except when she stepped out, into the corridor, the whole castle had changed. No shouting. No clatter of pots. Just a low hum of whispers, servants freezing mid-scrub to stare at her like she'd grown a second head overnight. The head cook, a woman who hadn't handed anyone anything, without barking an order first in 15 years, silently passed Issa a piece of bread. No chores. No orders. Just silence and stares. Because word had already crawled through every hallway in the castle like smoke under a door. The quiet, plain-faced orphan had done something the realm's best healers, its strongest soldiers, its finest minds, hadn't managed in a year. She'd tamed the beast. Issa. Oren. The king's steward. Standing in the kitchen doorway, with an expression that split the difference between fascination and dread. The king has requested your presence, he said. Immediately. Fear hit her like cold water down the back of the neck. The walk to the royal wing felt longer than it had the night before, which didn't make sense, except it did, because last night she'd been walking toward death, and today she was walking toward something she had no name for. Something worse, maybe, in its own way. Uncertainty had teeth too. What if last night had been a fluke? What if he'd woken up, and remembered nothing, but the shame of a servant seeing him at his lowest? What if this was the part, where they threw her, into the frozen wastes for daring to witness a king unmade? The doors swung open. And the room was unrecognizable. Sunlight instead of shadow. The broken furniture, gone. The chains hanging empty against the stone, slack, harmless, like snakes that had shed their venom in the night. Kailyn sat by the hearth. Fully dressed. Dark tunic. Hair combed back, from a face that, in daylight, looked less like a monster, and more like a man carrying the weight of a crown, that had gotten too heavy to hold alone. He looked at her. And didn't look away. "Leave us, Oren." The steward hesitated. "Sire, the council is." "Leave us." Gentler this time. But it left no room for argument. The door clicked shut. Silence pooled in the space between them. "You're trembling," Kailyn said. Quiet. Like he was talking to something wild he didn't want to spook. "I don't bite. Not when I'm myself." "Your Majesty." Her voice cracked in the middle of the word. "I asked you here," he said, "because I have a request." She waited. Braced. "I want you to stay near me today. Sit by the fire. Read, if you like. Do whatever pleases you." A pause. "Just stay in the room." She blinked. "That's all, sire?" "That's all." She looked at the empty chains. Then back at his eyes, steady, unthreatening, nothing like the amber horror from the night before. "I can do that." Something shifted in his face at those 5 words. The tight lines around his eyes eased. And then a smile. Small. Unpracticed. Like a muscle that hadn't been used in longer than it should have gone unused. Behind them, the door cracked open, Oren, returning with a ledger, and stopped dead in the threshold. Because it had been over a year since anyone in that castle had seen King Kailyn smile. The days that followed built their own strange rhythm. Issa stopped scrubbing pots. Stopped hauling water from the well, until her hands cracked in the cold. Instead, she was brought to the king's chambers at dawn, and stayed until the fire burned low each night. At first, it was just meals. Kailyn across the table, handling silverware with a careful, deliberate grace that felt like restraint dressed up as manners. He was polite. Too polite. The kind of polite that hums with something underneath it, something coiled and waiting. His eyes tracked her. Everything. The way she held her cup. The way she chewed. The pulse at her throat. It was the look of a starving man forcing himself to eat slow. By the end of the week, the meals stretched into hours. She'd sit by the window, with a history book she could barely make sense of. He'd sit at his desk buried in ledgers. Neither of them spoke much. But she felt him. Constantly. A weight in the room, that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with attention. The kind of attention that made the small hairs on her arms stand up even when he wasn't looking at her. On the 7th evening, it broke. Wind rattled the high windows. Kailyn slammed his ledger shut, sharp, sudden, a gunshot in the quiet, and Issa's book slid off her lap, and hit the floor. "Your Majesty." Her heart kicked into a full sprint. He stood. Crossed the room. Slow. Deliberate. Stopped just outside the edge of her space, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him like a hearth left burning too long. "I have been patient," he said. Low. Rough. "A week, and I've searched. Questioned the guards. Gone through texts older than this kingdom. And I am no closer to an answer." "An answer to what, sire?" He leaned down. Braced a hand against the chair beside her shoulder. The proximity did something to her head, made the room tilt slightly, made the scent of him, cedar, and something colder underneath, like the first snow of winter, impossible to ignore. "What did you do to me?" "I don't understand," she stammered. "The fog." His eyes flashed. "The madness. A year, and no healer could touch it. No magic could bind it. And you walked into that room, an ordinary servant, and it vanished. Like it was never there. I didn't do anything, Issa said, panic climbing fast now, sharp and cold. I swear it. I was just standing there. I thought you'd kill me. He stared at her. A king trained to smell a lie the way a hunter smells blood. He found nothing but fear. Real fear. Raw and shaking and impossible to fake. Something in his shoulders loosened. You really don't know, he whispered. And in that whisper, awe. And dread. Both at once, tangled together in a way that made her chest ache, without knowing why. Please, she said, a tear slipping loose, before she could stop it. I'm just a maid. I don't know magic. If I've offended you. No. The word came out of him fast. Instant. A low, possessive growl underneath it, that shook something loose in the floorboards. He caught himself immediately, took a step back, hands curling into fists at his sides like the only way to keep from reaching for her was to give his hands something else to do. You are not in trouble, he said, softer now. Something almost pleading underneath the royal weight of his voice. But I cannot let you leave. Not yet. Why? Because whatever you carry. He held her gaze. Whatever you are. It is the only thing keeping the beast at bay. He turned back to his desk. Left the weight of that sentence hanging in the air behind him like smoke that wouldn't clear. Issa pressed a hand to her own chest. Felt her heart pounding underneath her palm. She was trapped now. Not by chains. By a mystery neither of them could solve. The mystery had a name, though neither of them knew it yet. And 2 floors below, in a room lit by a single candle, and a fire that had burned down to coals, a man was starting to find the thread that would eventually unravel all of it. Orphaned sat at a narrow desk in the archive wing, a stack of kitchen ledgers in front of him, a pocket watch resting by his elbow. He hadn't slept in 2 days. Because something about all this didn't sit right. A curse that no priest could name, no healer could touch, no scholar could trace to any known text, and it vanishes the instant one particular servant walks into the room. That wasn't magic behaving the way magic behaved. That was something with a cause. A mechanism. And mechanisms left evidence. He'd started with the food. Every meal sent up to the king in the 8 months, before Issa arrived. Every ingredient, every supplier, every hand that touched the tray between the kitchen and the door. It was tedious work. The kind of work most men in his position would have handed off to someone else. But Orphaned had served 3 kings in his life, and he'd learned one thing, that never changed no matter which crown sat on which head. The people who want a throne rarely take it with a sword. They take it with patience. He turned another page. Ran his finger down a column of dried herbs requisitioned for the royal kitchen. Most of it, ordinary. Rosemary. Thyme. The kind of thing that showed up on every ledger in every kitchen in the realm. Except for one entry. Small. Easy to miss. A shipment of dried root, purchased not through the royal kitchen's usual supplier, but through a private order, paid for, according to the notation in the margin, by a steward's discretionary account, that had been quietly closed, and reopened under a different name 3 times in the last year. Orphaned sat back. Stared at the page like it might rearrange itself, into something less dangerous, if he looked at it long enough. It didn't. He thought of the word he hadn't let himself think in weeks. Not madness. Not curse. Poison. Slow. Deliberate. The kind that didn't kill a man outright, because killing a king outright brought soldiers, and inquiries and suspicion. No. The kind that unmade a man instead. Slowly. Quietly. Until the court itself started whispering that the throne needed a steadier hand. Until the court started looking for someone new to put on it. Oren's hand trembled slightly as he closed the ledger. He would need proof. Real proof, not a line in a book that could be explained away by 100 innocent reasons. He would need to know who authorized that account. Who received the shipments? Who benefited from a king too far gone in madness to rule? But first, he needed to know if the young woman upstairs, the one everyone in the castle was suddenly whispering about, the one who'd apparently done what none of them could, had anything to do with any of it. Because coincidences that convenient made Oren nervous. And he had not survived 3 reigns by ignoring nervous. Issa didn't know any of this yet. What she knew was this. She was standing in a room she used to fear, watching a king, who used to be a monster carefully avoid looking directly at her, both of them pretending the air between them wasn't thick, with something neither of them had a word for. "You should eat," Kailyn said. Not looking up from his ledger. "The bread's gone cold twice already." "I'm not very hungry, sire." "Kailyn." She glanced up. "When it's just us," he said. Still not looking at her. "You may call me Kailyn." Something warm bloomed in her chest, small and unwelcome, and impossible to stamp out. "That doesn't seem appropriate. Neither does a king kneeling in the mud." He set his quill down. Finally met her eyes. "And yet, somehow, I imagine I will do exactly that before this is over." She didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. But there was something in the way he said it, certainty, wrapped around something like dread, that made the hair on her arms rise again, the same way it had, that first night in the dark. "You speak strangely for a king," she said, before she could stop herself. A ghost of a smile. "I've had a strange year." The whispers about her had already left the servant halls, and crawled up into the drawing rooms by the second week. Issa felt it the moment she stepped into the eastern corridor, with an armful of pressed linens. Conversation stopped. Fans snapped open. Skirts rustled out of her path, not out of respect, but with a theatrical unease, like she carried something contagious. "Look at her," a voice murmured, not bothering to lower itself much. "The little mouse who tamed the beast. I heard she doesn't leave his side even to sleep. Dark magic. Has to be. What else explains it?" Issa kept her head down. Kept walking. Because before, she'd been invisible, a gray shape blending into gray stone, unnoticed, unremarkable, safe in her unimportance. Now she was a target with no armor. "They're looking at you," a voice said, from the shadow of a marble alcove, "like you're a loaded weapon." Oren. Stepping out, pulling her gently behind a tapestry, away from the thoroughfare. "I'm only doing as His Majesty commands," she said. "When they sent you into that chamber," Oren said, voice low, "you were a joke. Entertainment while they waited for the king to lose his throne along with his mind. I know. But you survived. Worse, you tamed him. And powerful people despise what they cannot understand." His eyes were sharp, tired, weighing something he hadn't decided whether to say out loud. "They destroy what they cannot control, Issa. You are a variable no one accounted for. To them, you are not a miracle. You are a threat." A cold feeling settled low in her stomach. "Master Oren." She hesitated. "Do you know what's wrong with him? Truly?" Something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation. Caution. "I have theories," he said carefully. "Nothing proven yet." "What kind of theories?" He studied her face for a long moment. Long enough that she felt exposed under it, like he was checking her for something, a tell, a flicker of guilt, some sign that the girl standing in front of him wasn't quite what she seemed. He must not have found it. Be careful in these halls, he said instead. Alone, if you can help it. That's all I'll say for now. He left her standing behind the tapestry, heart hammering, more unanswered questions crowding into her chest than she'd walked in with. That night, unable to sleep, Issa did something she hadn't done in years. She opened the small wooden box under her cot. The only thing she owned, that had belonged to her mother. A cracked comb. A pressed flower, long since gone to dust. And a scrap of cloth, folded so many times, over the years, that the creases had worn thin and soft. She unfolded it under the thin moonlight coming, through her narrow window. A symbol. Stitched in faded silver thread, half unraveled now, but still visible, if you looked hard enough. A crescent shape, curved like a blade, with 3 small marks radiating out, from its inner edge like rays of light escaping a closed door. She'd seen this symbol before. Not in a book. Not in a memory of her mother explaining it to her, because her mother never had, in fact, gone quiet and strange every time young Issa asked about it, until Issa had learned not to ask at all. She'd seen it 2 nights ago. Carved, faint but unmistakable, into the stone, where the iron chains had been bolted, into King Kailyn's chamber wall. Her hands went cold. Coincidence, she told herself. It has to be a coincidence. A common shape. A ward against evil, maybe, carved into every prison cell in the kingdom for all she knew. Except she didn't believe that. Not really. Because her mother had never talked about her past. Not the village she came from, not her family, not why she'd ended up scrubbing floors in a kitchen far from wherever home had once been. Every question met the same soft, sad deflection. Some things are safer left buried, love. Someday you'll understand why. Issa had always assumed it was shame. Poverty. The ordinary, unremarkable tragedy of a woman who'd fallen on hard times, and didn't want her daughter to inherit the weight of it. Now, holding this scrap of cloth under moonlight, staring at a symbol carved into a king's prison wall, she wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure of anything. 3 days later, Orphan found his answer to a different question. And it terrified him more than the poison ever had. He'd requested, carefully, quietly, under the pretense of routine inventory, access to the servant registry going back 15 years. Every name that had ever worked in that castle's kitchens. Every reference, every point of origin, every scrap of history the palace bothered to keep on people it considered replaceable. Most entries were thin. A name. A village. Sometimes not even that. Issa's mother's entry was thinner than most. Name given only as Marin. No village of origin listed. No family name. Just a notation, faded and half illegible, from the steward who'd hired her. Arrived alone. Refused further questions. Skilled with herbs, kept for that reason. Skilled with herbs. Orphan read that line 4 times. Because the woman, whose daughter now sat beside a poisoned king, keeping his madness at bay, with nothing anyone could explain, that woman had arrived at this castle alone, with no history, and a gift for exactly the kind of knowledge someone would need to slowly, patiently unmake a man's mind. It could mean nothing. It could mean everything. Orphan closed the ledger, and sat very still in the candlelight, turning the 2 possibilities over like coins, unable to decide which side he was more afraid would land face up. Because if Issa's mother had known something about poisons, about the old herbs, the slow-burning kind, that mimicked madness instead of killing outright, then either Issa was innocent, and in more danger than she understood. Or she wasn't innocent at all. And Orphan, who had served 3 kings, and buried 2 of them, had learned that the difference between those 2 possibilities sometimes came down to nothing more than which story got told first, and by whom, and how convincingly. He needed more. He needed to know who Marin really was. Where she'd truly come from. What she'd been running, from when she arrived at this castle, with a baby on her hip, and a silence around her past, that no one had ever managed to crack. And he had a terrible, creeping suspicion that whoever had put that poison in the king's food already knew the answer. Which meant Issa wasn't just a mystery. She was a target. And she had no idea. Issa didn't know she was being watched, from two directions now, Oren's cautious suspicion on one side, and something colder, something with real teeth, gathering itself on the other. She only knew that the king had started sleeping. Truly sleeping. Not the fitful, thrashing half-consciousness Oren had described, from the months before her arrival, but real rest, hours of it, his chest rising, and falling slow, and even while she sat by the dying fire, with a book she'd stopped pretending to read. She watched him sometimes. Not out of duty. Not because anyone had asked her to. Because there was something in his face, when he slept, that vanished the moment he woke, a kind of peace, that made him look younger than his years, made the crown, and the scars, and the weight of a broken kingdom fall away, until he was just a man, exhausted, finally allowed to stop fighting for a few hours. She wondered what he'd looked like before. Before the madness. Before whatever had done this to him. She wondered, with a small, guilty ache she didn't examine too closely, what it would be like to know him that way. Whole. On the 9th night, he woke suddenly. Sat up too fast, breath ragged, eyes wild for one disoriented second, before they found her by the fire and cleared. "You're still here," he said. Voice rough with sleep. "You asked me to stay." "I did." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I keep waiting for you to change your mind." "Why would I do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something vulnerable crossing his face, quickly hidden, the way a man hides a wound he's ashamed of. "Because everyone eventually does," he said quietly. "One way or another." She didn't have an answer for that. So she didn't give one. Instead, she moved her chair a little closer to the fire, a little closer to him, and picked her book back up, and after a moment, he lay back down, and the room settled, into the same easy quiet it had held before. Neither of them spoke again that night. But something had shifted. Something neither of them had named yet, and wouldn't, not for a while longer, because naming a thing made it real, and real things could be taken away. 2 days later, the first test came. Not one either of them had asked for. Kailyn had a council meeting, that couldn't be delayed, border reports, grain taxes, the ordinary grinding machinery of a kingdom, that didn't stop turning just because its king was fighting a war inside his own skull. It required him in the war room. It did not, by any tradition anyone could point to, require a kitchen maid. "You'll be fine for an hour," Oren said to him quietly, in the corridor outside, watching the king's jaw tighten at the mere suggestion. "It's a council meeting, sire. Not a battlefield." Kailyn didn't answer. He was already looking back toward the door Issa stood behind, back in his chambers, unaware that a decision was being made about her without her. "An hour," Kailyn finally said. Like he was negotiating a treaty. No more. He lasted 40 minutes. Oren watched it happen, from across the war room table, the subtle tightening around the king's eyes, the way his hand curled slowly, into a fist against the parchment map in front of him, the faint tremor, that started in his jaw, and spread, slow and terrible, down through his shoulders. The generals didn't notice at first. Too busy shouting over border patrols. Oren noticed. He always noticed. "Sire." Low. Urgent. "Sire, perhaps we should." "I'm fine." Through gritted teeth. Amber flickering, just at the edges of his hazel eyes, like a candle guttering in a draft. He wasn't fine. Oren made a decision that would have gotten him executed under half the kings he'd served. He stood, walked to the door, and sent the nearest guard running for the servants' hall, with an order that needed no explanation. "Bring the girl. Now." Issa was refolding linens, when the guard burst in, breathless, and she didn't wait for him to finish the sentence. She ran. Down corridors she'd only recently learned to navigate, past nobles who stared, and servants who scattered, her heart a drumbeat of pure animal urgency, that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with a fear she didn't have time to examine. She burst through the war room doors just as the low growls started building in Kailyn's throat, just as two generals began backing slowly away from the table, just as Oren's hand went, quiet, ready, resigned, to the hilt of a blade he prayed he wouldn't need. The pressure in the room broke the second she crossed the threshold. Like a held breath finally released. Kailyn's shoulders dropped. The amber bled back into hazel. The growl died in his throat, and became, instead, something almost like a sigh, relief so raw it looked like pain. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. He simply shifted his stance, just slightly, opening a space beside him at the table, silent, unmistakable, an invitation that every general in that room understood even if none of them dared say a word about it. Issa walked into that space. Stood at his shoulder. And the war room, a heartbeat later, went back to shouting about grain taxes like nothing at all had happened. Later that night, in the quiet of the king's chambers, Kailyn sat with his head in his hands, elbows braced on his knees, looking less like a monarch, and more like a man who'd just watched himself nearly become the thing he feared most. "I almost hurt them," he said. Quiet. Raw. "My own counsel. In my own war room. You didn't. Because you came." He looked up at her. "What happens the day you can't?" Issa didn't have an answer. Neither of them did. But that night, for the first time, Oren sat down across from both of them, and told them what he'd found in the ledgers, the strange shipment, the discretionary account opened, and closed under different names, the slow-burning root, that mimicked madness instead of causing it outright. Kailyn's face went very still as he listened. "Someone is doing this to me," he said, finally. "Not a question." "I believe so, sire." Deliberately. "For what? My throne?" "That would be my guess." Oren hesitated. Glanced, briefly, at Issa, and something in that glance made her stomach tighten, with unease she couldn't quite name. "There's something else. Something I haven't fully understood yet. Tell me." Oren's eyes stayed on Issa a moment longer than they needed to. "Your mother," he said slowly. "Do you know where she came from? Before this castle?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. "No," Issa said. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "She never told me. She said some things were safer left buried." Oren nodded, like this confirmed something he'd already suspected, and hoped he was wrong about. "I think," he said carefully, "that whatever is happening to the king, and whatever it is, that makes your presence able to stop it, those two things might share a root neither of us can see yet." Kailyn looked between them. "What does that mean?" "It means," Oren said, "that I don't think Issa walked into your chamber that first night by accident. I think someone sent her there hoping it would go one way. And instead, it went another. And I think whoever is behind this is only now realizing what a mistake they made." The fire popped in the silence that followed. Issa sat very still, her mother's crescent symbol suddenly heavy in her mind, the memory of it carved into cold stone behind an Alpha King's prison chains. Safer left buried, her mother had always said. She was starting to understand, with a dread that settled deep and cold in her chest, that whatever had been buried was not going to stay that way. Not anymore. Not now that it had already started climbing back up into the light. Outside, in the sprawling dark of the castle grounds, a man in a midnight blue coat stood at a high window, watching the faint glow of candlelight from the king's chambers, 3 floors up, that hadn't gone out in over a week now. He'd expected the girl to fail. Expected the king's mind to keep unraveling, slow and steady, exactly as planned, until the council had no choice but to look elsewhere for a steadier hand to wear the crown. Instead, some plain, nameless little servant had walked into that chamber, and undone in one night what he'd spent a year building, with patience and precision, and a small fortune spent on herbs that left no trace a healer would think to look for. He turned the thought over. Considered it from every angle, the way he considered everything, because rage without a plan was just noise, and he had never once in his life allowed himself the indulgence of noise. There was, he decided, a certain elegance to the problem. If the girl was the obstacle, then the girl needed to be understood, before she could be removed. Where she'd come from. What she carried in her blood, that let her do what a year of careful poison couldn't undo on its own. He had suspicions. Two of them, tangled together in a way that made his chest tighten, with something close to satisfaction. The first was simple. A name. A soldier's name, buried in old military records, a man who'd stood in front of a tribunal years ago, and destroyed his father's career, with a single sworn accusation. He had spent years learning that name, tracing it forward, through the generations, until it led him, improbably, to a servant girl scrubbing pots in a kitchen that should never have mattered to anyone. The second suspicion was older. Half legend, half warning, passed down through what remained of his family's private records. A bloodline the crown itself had once hunted to extinction, generations back, because it carried something dangerous in it. Something capable of calming even the most broken alpha mind, of binding a king's sanity to a single scent the way iron binds to a lodestone. A myth, most called it. He had never quite believed that. And if the daughter of the soldier, who ruined his father also happened to carry that old, hunted bloodline in her veins, then this was no longer only revenge. It was inheritance. Owed to him twice over. He turned from the window. Smoothed the front of his coat. And began, quietly, to plan his introduction to the girl everyone in the castle had suddenly started calling a miracle. He did not intend to let her stay one for very much longer. Issa didn't sleep that night either. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, her mother's crescent symbol clutched in one fist, turning over every conversation she'd ever had about her mother's past, and coming up, as always, empty. Safer left buried, love. But buried things had a way of surfacing eventually. She thought of the king, 3 floors above her, finally sleeping easy for the first time in a year, because of her. Because of something in her, that neither of them understood, something that had apparently followed her mother across whatever distance had separated her old life from this one. She thought of Oren's careful, worried eyes. She thought of the shipment of root herbs, purchased through an account, that kept changing its name like it was trying not to be found. Someone out there had done this to Kailyn. Deliberately. Patiently. With enough care, that it had taken a castle steward months of quiet digging just to find the first thread. And somewhere, tangled up in all of it, was her mother's silence. Her mother's fear. A symbol carved into a prison wall, that shouldn't have meant anything, and somehow meant everything. Issa closed her eyes. Made herself a promise in the dark, the same kind of quiet, stubborn promise she'd made herself 100 times, before in that castle, back when the only thing she had to survive was her own refusal to break. She was going to find out the truth. Whatever it cost her. Because for the first time in her life, staying silent didn't feel like safety anymore. It felt like the thing that might get someone she was starting to care about killed. And Issa, plain, unremarkable, nameless Issa, the girl the whole court had sent in to die, was done being the person things simply happened to. She was going to start finding out why they were happening at all. Morning came pale and gray, the kind of light that made the castle's old stone look even older, even colder, and Issa walked the long corridor toward the king's chambers, with her mother's symbol folded carefully into the seam of her apron, close against her skin, a secret she wasn't ready to share, yet with anyone. Not even him. Not until she understood it herself. Behind the heavy oak doors, King Kailyn waited for her, rested, clear-eyed, more himself with each passing day than he'd been in a year, and utterly unaware that the very thing keeping his mind whole was about to become the most contested secret in the entire kingdom. Somewhere below, in an archive lit by guttering candlelight, Orphan turned another page of a ledger that was slowly, methodically, leading him toward a truth that would upend everything he thought he understood about loyalty, bloodlines, and the quiet, dangerous cost of a king's survival. And somewhere beyond the castle walls, in a room draped in midnight blue, and old resentment, a man who had spent a year poisoning a king one careful spoonful at a time began sharpening a different kind of weapon entirely. One with a smile. One with soft words and softer hands. One built specifically, patiently, to be pointed at a girl, who didn't yet know she was standing in the exact center of a war that had started long before she was born. The doors opened. Kailyn looked up. And for just a moment, before the day's weight settled back onto his shoulders, something in his face eased at the sight of her, quiet, grateful, unguarded. "Good morning," he said. Issa stepped inside. The doors closed behind her. Breakfast that morning was different. Not the food. The food was the same: bread, a little cheese, tea gone lukewarm by the time anyone remembered to drink it. What was different was the silence between them. Not the old silence, the careful, watchful kind. Something looser now. Something that didn't need filling. "You look tired," Kailyn said. "So do you." "I slept 8 hours." He said it like a man reporting a miracle, because to him, it was one. "First time in over a year." "Then you should look rested." "I should." He turned his cup slowly on the table, not drinking from it. "Instead I lay awake most of the morning wondering why." Issa kept her eyes on her plate. Because she'd lain awake too. For entirely different reasons. A folded scrap of cloth. A symbol carved in stone. A mother who'd spent her whole life running from something she never named. "Issa." She looked up. "You've gone somewhere else," he said. Not accusing. Just noticing, the way he seemed to notice everything about her lately, filing it away like it mattered. "Where?" She almost told him. The word sat right there, at the edge of her tongue. "My mother had a symbol, the same one that's carved into your chamber wall, and I don't know what it means, and I'm afraid to find out." And then she thought of Orphan's careful, worried face the night before, the way he'd looked at her like she might be something other than what she seemed. If even Orphan wasn't sure yet, she wasn't ready to hand a half-formed fear to a king, whose sanity hung by a thread thin enough to snap. "Nowhere," she said instead. "Just tired." Kailyn studied her a moment longer. She had the distinct sense he didn't believe her. But he let it go, the way he'd started letting things go, with her, not out of indifference, but out of something that looked, if she squinted at it sideways, almost like trust. It made the lie sit heavier in her chest than it should have. Master Orphan spent that whole day in the archive, and by the time the candles had burned down to stubs, he had a name. Not a full one. Just a fragment, scratched into the corner of a decades-old shipping manifest he'd nearly overlooked 3 times, before finally noticing the pattern: a series of small transactions, spread out over years, all routed through a trading house on the kingdom's southern border. A trading house that, according to the Crown's own tax rolls, had quietly changed ownership 4 times in the last decade, always just before an audit was scheduled. Always just before someone might have started asking questions. The current owner of record was a shell. A name on paper, with no face behind it, the kind of arrangement only a man, with something to hide would bother constructing. But underneath the shell, buried 3 transactions deep in a ledger nobody, but a paranoid old steward would ever have the patience to untangle, was a signature. Small. Elegant. The kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who'd spent years being taught how to write beautifully, because beauty was currency at court. Oren didn't recognize the name outright. But he recognized the seal pressed beside it, a stylized raven, wings spread, the mark of a minor noble house, from the eastern provinces, that had, if he remembered correctly, lost most of its standing 2 generations back, after a scandal nobody talked about anymore. A house with old grievances. A house with nothing left to lose and, apparently, a very long memory. Oren closed the ledger, and sat back, rubbing his eyes, feeling every one of his 53 years settle into his bones at once. He needed more than a seal, and a signature. He needed to know who currently carried that name, whether they'd recently arrived at court, and whether they had any reason at all to want a mad king on the throne instead of a sane one. He had a terrible feeling he already knew where to start looking. Because new faces had been arriving at court all season, drawn in by rumors of a crumbling kingdom, and a throne that might, with the right push, become available to whoever positioned themselves cleverly enough to catch it, when it fell. And one new face in particular had been asking a great many questions about the quiet servant girl who'd apparently tamed the untamable king. Issa found Bren in the training yard 2 days later, working through drills, with a group of younger guards, his movements sharp, and economical even in the cold. She waited until the group dispersed before approaching. "Captain." He turned. Something in his face softened slightly, when he saw her, not the wary pity, from that first night anymore, but something closer to respect. "You're still in one piece," he said. "Didn't expect that, the day I sent you, through those doors." "Neither did I." He studied her for a moment. "What do you need?" She hesitated. There wasn't an easy way to ask this. "Do you remember my mother?" "Marin. She worked in the kitchens, years back." Something shifted behind his eyes. "Careful. Guarded." "I remember her," he said slowly. "Quiet woman. Kept to herself." "Did she ever," Issa searched for the right way to say it, "did she ever seem frightened? Of something specific? Someone?" Bren was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Issa felt something cold settle in her stomach, because a man like Bren didn't hesitate over nothing. "There was a night," he said finally. "Years back. Before you were old enough to remember it. A writer came, through asking after a woman matching her description. Never gave a name. Never said who sent him. He met her eyes. Your mother didn't come out of her quarters for 3 days after that. Wouldn't explain why. What happened to the writer? Left before morning. Never came back, far as I know." He paused. "Your mother requested a transfer to the deep kitchens not long after. Out of sight. I always assumed she was hiding from something. Never asked what." "Did she ever mention my father?" Issa asked. "I was told he was a soldier. That's all anyone ever gave me." Bren's face went carefully, deliberately blank. "Your father served under the old king," he said, slower now, choosing each word like it might cost him something. "Before your time. There was an inquiry, years back. Accusations of corruption against another officer's family. Your father gave testimony, that ended a man's career." He hesitated. "I don't know more than that. It was before I held this post." Issa's throat felt tight. "Thank you," she managed. Bren nodded, but as she turned to go, he caught her arm, gentle, but firm. "Issa." His voice dropped. "Whatever this is. Be careful who you ask about it. Not everyone in this castle has your best interests in mind. Some of them never did." She thought of the court women's laughter. The lace fans hiding smirks. The whispers that had followed her down every corridor, since that first terrible night. "I know," she said quietly. "I don't think you do," Bren said. "Not yet." He let go of her arm, and walked away, and Issa stood alone in the cold training yard, feeling for the first time like the ground beneath her had always been thinner than she realized. That evening, a new face appeared at the edge of the great hall during the evening meal, tall, dressed in tailored midnight blue, blonde hair swept back, with the kind of careless precision that took considerable effort to achieve. Issa noticed him because everyone noticed him. He had that quality some people carried, an ease that drew eyes, without ever seeming to ask for them. "Who is that?" she asked quietly, seated at her usual place near the king, though her place at Kailyn's side during meals had become such an established fact by now, that no one dared question it any more, not even the court women, who still hated her for it. Kailyn followed her gaze, and something in his posture went very slightly rigid. "Lord Draven," he said. "Arrived at court a fortnight past. Eastern provinces." A pause. "Petitioning for restored standing. His family lost most of its holdings 2 generations back. He looks at you like he's studying you. He looks at everyone like he's studying them." Kailyn's jaw tightened. "It's a particular kind of charm. I've met men like him before. They're rarely as harmless as they appear." Issa watched the newcomer move through the hall, pausing here and there to exchange easy words with this noble or that lady, leaving smiles in his wake like breadcrumbs. He didn't approach the king's table. But as the meal wound down, and Issa rose to help clear the last of the plates, an old habit she hadn't fully broken despite no longer being required to, she felt eyes on her, and turned, and found Lord Draven watching her, from across the hall. He smiled. Small. Private. Like they already shared a secret. She looked away first. But the feeling of being studied, measured, weighed, filed away for some purpose she couldn't guess at, stayed with her long, after the hall had emptied. Oren found her later, that night, in the narrow corridor outside her quarters, moving fast enough, that she knew, before he spoke, that something had changed. "The Eastern Provinces," he said, without preamble. "The House of the Raven Seal. Do you know it?" "No." "Lord Draven's family," he said. "Fallen out of standing 2 generations back. I need you to think very carefully, Issa. Did your mother ever mention that name? Ever, in passing, even once?" Issa's mind raced backward, through every fragment of memory she had of her mother, the quiet evenings, the careful silences, the way her mother's hands used to still whenever certain topics came too close. And then, unbidden, a memory surfaced. Small. Nearly forgotten. Her mother, years ago, staring at a crest stitched into a passing noble's cloak during a rare trip beyond the castle walls, going pale and silent, and pulling Issa quickly down a side street without explanation. A raven. Wings spread. "I think," Issa said slowly, her voice unsteady, "I think she was afraid of them. Whoever they are." Oren's face went carefully, deliberately blank, the expression of a man working very hard not to let his fear show. "Then we have a problem," he said. "Because Lord Draven arrived at court the same week the king's condition began its sharpest decline. And I have just spent an hour confirming that his family's discretionary funds trace back to the very trading house that supplied the herbs poisoning our king." Issa felt the floor tilt beneath her. "You think he did this?" "I think," Oren said carefully, "that whoever did this has been waiting a very long time for an opportunity. And I think that opportunity may have something to do with your mother, and whatever she spent her whole life running from." He hesitated. "And it may have something to do with your father as well. Bren tells me there was a tribunal, years back. An accusation that ended another family standing. I believe Lord Draven's father may have been the man on the losing end of it." The weight of it settled over her slowly, like snow accumulating on a branch, until the branch could no longer hold it. "You think he blames me," she said. "For something my father did, before I was even born." "I think," Oren said, "that grief-like, that doesn't always look for the guilty party. Sometimes it only looks for someone close enough to hurt." I wasn't planning to trust him, Issa said. Whatever charm he offers. Good. Oren's eyes softened, just slightly. You've done something remarkable for this kingdom, Issa, whether you understand it, yet or not. Don't let anyone convince you, that makes you disposable. He left her standing in the corridor, the cold seeping up, through the stone floor, into her bones, her mother's crescent symbol pressed hard against her palm, where she'd been clutching it, unconsciously, through the entire conversation. She didn't sleep again that night. Instead she sat by her narrow window, watching the moon crawl slow across a sky gone hard, and clear with early frost, turning everything she'd learned over in her mind like stones in a stream, searching for the shape underneath the surface. A symbol carved into a king's chamber wall. A mother who ran, and hid, and never once explained why. A writer who came asking, after a woman matching her mother's description, and vanished before dawn, and was never spoken of again. A father, a soldier, whose testimony had once ended another man's career, another family standing. A noble house, with a raven seal, fallen from grace 2 generations back, whose current heir had arrived at court the same week a king's mind began to unravel, and who had, apparently, already noticed her. Studied her. Smiled at her like they shared a secret she didn't, yet know she was part of. Issa thought of Kailyn sleeping easy for the first time in a year, 3 floors above her, unaware of how much danger might be circling both of them at once. She thought of the way he'd said her name, gentle, deliberate, like her name mattered more than any title he could have used instead. Mine, he'd said, that first terrible night in the dark. She hadn't understood it then. She wasn't sure she understood it now. But she understood this much, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest. Whatever was happening to him, whatever strange thread connected her presence to his sanity, it was not an accident. It had never been an accident. Someone, somewhere, had set all of this in motion a very long time ago. 2 old wounds, her father's testimony, her mother's bloodline, tangled together into a single, patient grievance that had finally found its way to her door. And she was done letting it happen to her, without understanding why. Tomorrow, she decided, she would go back to the archive herself. Would ask Oren to show her everything he'd found. Would stop waiting for other people to hand her pieces of a truth that belonged, more than anyone else's, to her. Because her mother had spent a lifetime burying this. And burying it, Issa was beginning to understand, hadn't kept anyone safe at all. It had only delayed the reckoning. And the reckoning, whatever shape it finally took, was coming for both of them now, for the king upstairs sleeping easier than he had in a year, and for the quiet, nameless servant girl who'd walked into his darkness and, without ever meaning to, lit something that a great many powerful people very badly wanted extinguished. The moon crossed higher. Somewhere below the castle walls, in a room draped in midnight blue, a man who had waited 2 generations for this exact moment sat awake, as well, turning his own plans over with the same patient, deliberate care. Neither of them slept. Neither of them, in their own way, were done waiting. And somewhere between the girl at her window, and the man in his dark room, a war neither of them had chosen was already quietly, irreversibly, underway. He found her in the conservatory. Which wasn't an accident. Nothing about Lord Draven was ever an accident. Issa understood that now. Understood it the way you understand a blade is sharp only, after it's already opened your skin. You've been avoiding me, he said. I've been busy. Everyone's busy. He stepped closer. Smiled that smile, practiced, warm, the kind that made rooms lean toward him, without meaning to. Busy is what people say, when they're afraid of a conversation. I'm not afraid of you, my lord. No. His eyes moved, over her face like he was reading something written there. I don't think you are. Which is rare. Most people in this castle are afraid of something. You're afraid of a different thing entirely. She didn't answer that. Because he wasn't wrong. And that terrified her more than, if he'd been lying. She almost turned and left right then. Oren's warning was still fresh, still ringing in her ears, from 2 nights before. Whatever charm he offers you, do not trust it. She had meant to keep her distance. Had told herself, walking into the conservatory only, because she needed dried time for the kitchens, and nowhere else to gather it this late in the season, that she would be brief. Polite. Nothing more. Except brief had a way of stretching once his voice found its rhythm. He told her a story that day. Slow. Careful. Laid out like a man setting a table for a meal he'd been planning for years. His father, he said. A soldier once. Respected, until he wasn't. Until a single accusation, leveled by a man Draven refused to name, at first, watching her face for a reaction she didn't give him, unraveled everything his family had built across 3 generations. They called him a thief, Draven said. Voice gone quiet. Almost gentle. Stripped his rank. His lands. His name, eventually, because a ruined man's name becomes a joke faster than you'd think. A pause, long enough to feel deliberate. He never recovered. Died believing the world had decided, once and for all, that he didn't matter. I'm sorry, Issa said. And meant it. Are you? Something shifted in his tone. Sharp, for just a moment. Then smoothed back over, quick, like water closing, over a stone dropped in a lake. I only ask, he said, because the man, who made that accusation, the soldier who destroyed my father's name, he had a daughter too. Around your age, I'd imagine. If she'd lived long enough to grow up in this world the way you have. The floor tilted. Just slightly. Because Issa's father had been a soldier. Because Issa's father had died, before she was old enough to remember his face, and her mother had never spoken of him either, not once, not ever, the same silence wrapped around 2 different ghosts. She thought, distantly, of Bren's words in the training yard. An inquiry. A testimony. A career ended. What was his name, she asked. The soldier. Draven watched her for a long moment. I think, he said softly, you already know. She didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Because if it was true, if her father was the man who'd ended Draven's father's career, then this had never only been about a curse. Not really. It had been about her too. About her blood. About a debt someone had been waiting a generation to collect, and she'd walked straight, into the middle of it wearing a servant's apron, thinking herself invisible. Except invisible people don't get watched. Except invisible people don't get stories whispered to them in dark conservatories by men, with ravens stitched into their collars. Which meant she'd never been invisible at all. Which meant every kindness Draven had shown her, every soft word, every careful, patient story, had been aimed. Like an arrow. Like something built for exactly this moment, exactly this doubt, exactly this hour of the night, when doubt does its worst work. She pressed her palms against her eyes, until color burst behind them. Stop, she told herself. Stop. He wants you frightened. Frightened people make mistakes. Oren warned you. You knew this already. So why does it still feel like new information? Except knowing that didn't make the fear go away. It just meant she was afraid, and aware of being afraid, which somehow felt worse. She told Oren the next morning. Made herself do it, even though some small, ashamed part of her wanted to keep the conversation, with Draven tucked away, unexamined, private. He knows about my father, she said. The tribunal. The accusation. Oren's face went very still. Then he's confirmed exactly what I feared, he said. Issa, listen to me. Whatever grief he's carrying, whatever wrong was done to his family, it does not make you responsible for it. You were an infant, when that tribunal took place. You had no more choice in it than he did. I know that. Do you? Oren's eyes were kind, but unflinching. Because grief has a way of making people forget who actually did the wronging. It's easier to hate a face you can see than a decision made a generation ago by men mostly dead now. Be careful. He may not even fully believe you're guilty of anything. That won't stop him from treating you like you are. She nodded. Told herself she'd remember it. She would not remember it as well as she needed to. The experiment started 3 days later. Though nobody called them experiments out loud. Oren called it routine errands. Kailyn called it necessary. Issa understood it for what it was, a slow, careful measurement of exactly how far she could go, and for how long, before the man she'd started to care for became something else entirely. 45 minutes, the first time. Oren's pocket watch. A silver dagger's edge of a smile, from Kailyn when she returned, relief written so plainly across his face it embarrassed them both. 50 minutes, the second time. Then 40. Then 38. Getting worse. Not better. It's shortening, Oren said one evening, voice low, careful, the way you deliver news about a wound that wasn't healing the way it should. Each cycle. A little faster than the last. What does that mean? Issa asked. Though some part of her already knew. It means, Kailyn said, before Oren could answer, that whatever you are to me, Issa. It isn't loosening its grip. It's tightening. He said it like a confession. Like something he'd been afraid to say out loud in case saying it made it more true than it already was. The garden, that night, was cold enough to bite. Frost on the hedges. A silver fountain frozen mid-splash, water caught forever in a shape it would never finish becoming. Kailyn walked beside her without guards. Without Oren. Without the crown, even, which he'd left somewhere back in his chambers like it was a coat too heavy for the evening. A year, he said. Staring at the frozen fountain instead of her. I felt my own mind slipping. Every night. Like sand through fingers I couldn't close fast enough. You don't have to. I do. He turned to face her. And there was nothing kingly left in his expression. Just a man. Exhausted. Bare. I chained myself, Issa. Ordered the iron forged myself, because I was more afraid of what I'd do to my own people than of what the madness would do to me. She didn't speak. Because there wasn't a version of speaking that wouldn't have broken something fragile in the air between them. When they sent you into that room, he went on, I thought you were a hallucination. A mercy my broken mind invented, before the end. His hand rose. Hesitated. Fell, then rose again, finally settling, warm, trembling, impossibly gentle, against her cheek. But you were real. And I have spent every day, since trying to find a reason for that. A spell. A cure. Something rational. Did you find one? No. His thumb moved, slow, across her cheekbone. And tonight, standing here, I find I no longer care to. The confession landed somewhere low in her chest. Warm. Terrifying. I don't want you to stay, because you're my cure, he said. I want you to stay, because you are the first thing in years that has made me feel like a man. Not a monster. His eyes held hers, fierce and unguarded all at once. I want you to stay for you. No order in it. No royal weight. Just a man, laying himself bare in a frozen garden, asking for something he had no right, by any law of that kingdom, to ask a servant girl to give him freely. She leaned into his palm. And for one long, suspended moment, standing in the frost, with his forehead nearly touching hers, Issa let herself believe that maybe, somehow, none of the rest of it mattered. The debt. The blood. The raven seal waiting patiently in the dark. She was wrong to believe that. She would learn exactly how wrong 3 days later. The letter arrived folded inside a book she hadn't ordered, delivered by a servant she didn't recognize, left on her narrow bed like a gift nobody wanted. Kailyn's seal pressed into the wax. Kailyn's hand, or close enough to it, that she wouldn't have questioned it a week ago. She read it once. Then again, because her mind refused, the first time, to accept what the words were saying. Use her as long as the fog requires it. Once the threat is fully contained, arrange for her removal from court. Quietly. She has served her purpose. Her hands shook so badly the parchment rattled. Because it explained everything. The garden. The soft words. Even the desperate honesty of the fog is gone, I no longer care, all of it, suddenly, reframed as performance. As management. As exactly the kind of careful, patient cruelty a king might extend toward a tool he intended to discard once it stopped being useful. He is an addict, Draven's voice echoed, unbidden, from somewhere in the back of her mind. And you are his only medicine. She wanted to believe it was false. Except the seal looked real. Except the hand looked real. Except every terrified, insecure part of her, the orphan, the nobody, the girl who'd spent her whole life being told exactly how replaceable she was, had been waiting her entire life for proof that she was right to expect this. There was a whisper of doubt somewhere underneath the panic. A small, stubborn voice that sounded almost like Oren. Question it. Ask him yourself, before you believe a stranger's handwriting, over a man who has never once lied to your face. She didn't listen to it. Because believing the worst had never once, in her whole life, disappointed her. She packed in silence. A spare dress. Her mother's cracked comb. The folded scrap of cloth, with its half-unraveled crescent, pressed flat against her chest like something that might still protect her, though she no longer had any idea from what. The corridors were empty at that hour. Good. She didn't trust her face not to give her away. She reached the servants' gate just as the last color bled out of the sky, twilight settling gray, and final over the frost-hardened ground. Beyond the bars, a dark shape waited in the tree lean. A carriage. Freedom, if you wanted to call it that. A life where she was no one's cure, and no one's secret, and no one's problem to quietly remove. Her hand closed around the cold iron latch. Stop, some small, stubborn part of her whispered. Something's wrong. This doesn't feel like him. Except the letter felt real enough. Except real enough was apparently all it took, after everything, to undo weeks of trust in a single evening. She closed her eyes. Pushed the gate. And the entire castle shattered behind her. It wasn't a sound, so much as a wound. Torn straight out of the twilight, raw and endless, rattling the iron bars beneath her fingers, before she even understood what she was hearing. A roar. Not rage. Grief. The sound of a man discovering, all at once, that the only light he had left had already walked out the door. Issa froze. Her whole body locked in place, hands still on the latch, heart slamming so hard it hurt, because that sound, that terrible, splitting sound, hadn't come from a king losing his throne. It had come from a man losing her. And somewhere behind her, deep in the royal wing, 3 floors up, something that had taken weeks to build back into a man was tearing itself apart all over again. Because of a letter she hadn't questioned nearly hard enough. Because of a fear that had been waiting her whole life for exactly this kind of proof. None of this had happened by accident, and none of it had happened in a single evening either. Draven had not simply appeared in the conservatory that first afternoon on a whim. He had chosen his moment. Watched the corridors for a week before that. Learned her patterns the way a hunter learns a deer's trail, not through cleverness, so much as patience, and patience was the one thing Draven had in abundance, cultivated across 2 generations of a family that had lost everything and spent every year since quietly, carefully, plotting how to take it back. He'd started small. A flower left on folded linens. Pale yellow. Winter rose. A note that wasn't a note at all, just 3 words. For the resilient one. She hadn't asked for it. Hadn't wanted it. But she'd noticed it. Which was the point. Because attention, once given, is hard to fully take back. You shouldn't have, she'd told him, that first time, the flower resting untouched between them. Nonsense. His smile, warm as poured honey. I see how tirelessly you work. The court treats you as a tool. I see something else entirely. She hadn't believed him. Not fully. But some small, exhausted part of her, the part that had spent a lifetime being told exactly how little she mattered, had wanted to. Just a little. Just enough to keep listening the next time he found her alone. Which was, of course, exactly what he'd counted on. Master Oren noticed the visits, before Issa admitted them to herself. Servants talk. Servants always talk, and Oren had spent 3 reigns learning how to listen to what they said, without ever once looking like he was listening at all. Lord Draven, seen near the conservatory. Lord Draven, seen near the linen stores. Lord Draven, always somehow exactly, where the king's companion happened to be alone. Oren didn't like coincidences. He liked them even less, when they wore a raven seal. He went to Kailyn first. Because loyalty, in Oren's experience, meant telling a man the truth, before the truth found a way to hurt him on its own. Sire. A word. Kailyn looked up, from his ledgers, already half distracted, the way he'd been half distracted, with everything that wasn't Issa for weeks now. Go on. Lord Draven. He's been seeking her out. Alone. More than once. Something went very still in the king's face. Seeking out, he repeated. Slow. Careful. Testing the shape of the words like they might cut him, if he handled them wrong. I don't yet know his intentions, Oren said. But I know his family's history. And I know the man doesn't do anything, without a reason he isn't telling you. Kailyn set down his quill. Then find the reason, he said. Voice gone low. Dangerous, in a way, that had nothing to do with the fog anymore, and everything to do with something far more human. Before he finds hers. Which was the part of the story Issa never learned in time. Because that same night, the night Oren warned the king, the night Kailyn's jaw locked tight enough to ache, someone slipped into the small antechamber off the royal scriptorium, where the king kept his private correspondence. Someone who knew exactly how the wax seal was pressed. Someone who had, in fact, spent considerable coin acquiring a duplicate of that very seal months earlier, tucked away for a moment just like this one. The letter took less than 10 minutes to write. 10 minutes, and years of patient waiting, folded into a handful of cruel, deliberate sentences designed to land exactly where they'd hurt the most. Because Draven understood something about Issa, that even Kailyn hadn't fully grasped yet. He understood that a girl raised on scraps, and dismissal doesn't need much convincing, that she's disposable. She's spent her whole life being handed exactly that proof, over and over, by people with far less imagination than a forged letter and a stolen seal. You didn't have to break someone like that. You just had to confirm what they already, quietly, believed about themselves. So when Issa stood at the servants' gate, with her hand on cold iron, and the world's worst timing settling in around her, she wasn't only reacting to a letter. She was reacting to a lifetime. Every court woman's laugh. Every closed door. Every small, careless cruelty that had taught her, long before Draven ever wrote a single forged word, that love from someone powerful always came, with an expiration date attached. It's tempting, watching from outside a story like this, to think the mistake was simple. A letter. A misunderstanding. Something easily forgiven once the truth comes out. Except grief doesn't work on a timeline that convenient. Except trust, once cracked, doesn't heal just because someone finally explains the crack wasn't real. Some fears don't need evidence at all. They only need an opening. Draven had given her one. And now, whatever happened next, the two of them, the king who'd finally learned to sleep, and the girl who'd finally let herself believe she mattered to someone, were both about to find out exactly how much that single opening was going to cost them. Somewhere in the royal wing, at almost the exact moment Issa's hand closed on the iron latch, Kailyn had been standing, over a ledger, half listening to a border report he couldn't make himself care about. Because something felt wrong. Not the fog. He knew the fog by now, knew its slow crawl, its particular weight behind the eyes. This was different. Sharper. A cold drop in his chest, that had nothing to do with madness and everything to do with instinct, the kind bred into him long before any curse ever touched his mind. He stood so fast his chair scraped back and toppled. "Sire?" A general, mid-sentence, blinking up at him. Kailyn didn't answer. He was already moving. Down the hall. Past guards who scrambled to fall in behind him, and gave up, within the first 10 strides, because no one, not even trained soldiers, could match the pace of a king, who had just realized, with total and terrible certainty, that something he could not survive losing was already gone. He reached her empty chamber first. The narrow bed. Untouched linens. A drawer left open, half its contents missing. And on the small table beside it, a single sheet of parchment, crumpled and smoothed out again, like someone had read it, and reread it, and hated every word, while doing so. He picked it up. Read 3 lines, before the parchment started to shake in his grip. Because he recognized the seal. And because he had never, not once, dictated a single word of what was written beneath it. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. Not slow. Not gentle. All at once, the way the worst truths always arrive, too late to matter, exactly when it matters most. Someone had forged this. Someone had put these words in his mouth, and let her read them alone, in the dark, with no one there to tell her they were lies. He didn't remember deciding to run. He only remembered the corridor blurring past him, the cold air of the lower halls burning in his lungs, guards shouting somewhere behind him, that he was moving too fast, too reckless, that they couldn't keep pace, and none of it mattering, none of it registering, because somewhere ahead of him, past stone and iron, and a servant's gate, that had never once in its history mattered this much, the only thing that had made the last year bearable was walking away, from him believing a lie he never told. That was the thought in his head, when the sound finally tore loose, from his own throat. Not a command. Not even really a word. Just grief, given voice, echoing off ancient stone loud enough to shake it, the sound Issa heard, from the gate, the sound that froze her hand on cold iron, the sound of a king, who had survived a year of madness discovering, in a single terrible instant, that losing her felt like something far worse than any curse had ever managed. Issa's hand hadn't moved. The roar was still rolling, through the stone beneath her feet, and something in her chest, something stubborn, something that had survived worse nights than this one, was asking a question she didn't want to answer. That doesn't sound like a man discarding his tool. Except doubt, once it takes root, doesn't uproot itself easily. Except she'd believed the letter an hour ago, with her whole exhausted, orphaned heart, and belief that deep doesn't dissolve just because a sound in the distance complicates it. So she stood there. Caught between 2 truths, that couldn't both be real, twilight burning down, into full dark around her, while somewhere behind her a broken king ran faster than he had ever run in his life, chasing the last piece of himself, that still felt whole. The gate shuddered before it opened. One impact. That was all it took. Iron shrieking against iron, the whole frame swinging inward like the castle itself had decided to stop pretending it could hold him back. Kailyn didn't come as a king. He didn't come as an alpha either, not the way the word usually meant something dangerous, something to fear. He came the way a man runs, when he's already lost the thing he was running toward, and hasn't caught up, yet to the fact, that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost it at all. Tunic torn at the shoulder. Hair wild. Eyes wide and amber lit, and searching, until they found her standing frozen at the gate, and locked on like something breaking the surface of deep water, after too long underneath. He didn't reach for her. Didn't try to. He crossed the distance in 3 staggering strides, and then stopped himself, hard, like hitting a wall only he could see. And then he went down. Knees. Frozen mud. Hands splayed open on the cold ground. A king. Kneeling. Don't, he choked out. Not a command. Nothing close to one. Just a raw, broken sound dragged up, from somewhere underneath every title he'd ever carried. Please. Issa. Don't go. She stared down at him. At the most powerful man in the realm, on his knees in the dirt, and something in her chest cracked wide open, because this wasn't performance. This wasn't the careful, patient cruelty of a man managing an asset he intended to discard. This was a man, who thought he'd already lost everything. You don't understand, she whispered. Tears freezing on her lashes, before they'd even fully fallen. Lord Draven. He said, he showed me a letter. Your seal. It said I was only a cure. That once you didn't need me anymore. A tool. His laugh came out broken. Bitter. If you were a tool, Issa, I would have locked you somewhere safe, and never let you near a war room, never let you near a council chamber, never let a single soul in this castle learn your name. He dragged himself forward, through the mud, close enough now, that she could see every line of exhaustion carved into his face. I don't care what you are. Servant. Orphan. Something older than either of us understands yet. I only know, that before you, I was a thing, that lived in the dark, and dreamed of blood. His eyes held hers. Ferocious. Unguarded. You looked at me, he said, and you didn't see the scars. You saw me. He braced his hands against his own thighs. Knuckles white. Holding himself back, letting her choose, because even like this, desperate, broken open, some part of him refused to take the choice away from her. I cannot survive another year in the dark, he said. I am not asking as your king. I am asking, as a man, who finally found his way back to the light. Please. Do not leave me to the beast. Something in Issa gave way. Not broke. Gave way. The difference mattered, though she wouldn't have been able to explain it in that moment, kneeling down in the frozen mud across from him, reaching out to cradle a face that had haunted her nightmares once, and now, somehow, felt like the only safe place left in the world. I'm not going, she whispered. His breath left him in one long, shuddering exhale. He leaned forward, until his forehead rested against hers, and for one suspended heartbeat, neither of them was royalty or servant, cursed man or frightened girl. Just 2 people, who had found their way back to each other, through a lie designed to keep them apart. You are not a monster, she said. And that was the moment the shadows at the treeline finally moved. How touching. Draven's voice. Thin now. Ragged at the edges in a way his court smile had never allowed anyone to hear before. Kailyn's head snapped up. Whatever softness had lived in his face a heartbeat earlier vanished, replaced by something dark and immediate, something that put his body between Issa and the shadows, without any conscious decision required. A king, Draven went on, stepping into the moonlight, reduced to a beggar in the mud. Over a servant girl. His lip curled. It really is a pitiful little tragedy. Leave us, Kailyn said. Voice gone low. Lethal. Your presence here is treason. Treason. Draven laughed, and there was nothing warm left in it now, nothing of the honeyed charm that had drawn court ladies, and quiet servant girls alike, into his orbit for weeks. You have no idea what treason is. You're a hollow thing wearing a crown, and I should have finished what I started months ago. Issa felt something cold settle deep in her stomach. What did you do? She asked. Draven's eyes found hers. And for just a moment, something almost human flickered there, grief, maybe, old and worn thin, from carrying it too long. I did what should have been done a generation ago, he said. Your father destroyed mine with a single accusation. Took his name, his rank, everything he'd built, and for what? For doing exactly what soldiers are trained to do. His hand disappeared inside his coat. I watched my father die believing the world had decided he didn't matter. I decided the world owed him something back. So you poisoned an innocent man, Issa said. For a debt that was never mine to pay. Innocent. Draven's laugh cracked, sharp and humorless. No one in this castle is innocent. Least of all him. He nodded toward Kailyn. His father signed the order that ruined mine. Did you know that? No. Of course not. Nobody bothers telling servants the truth about the men they kneel for. He paused. Something colder settling into his voice now, something that had less to do with grief and more to do with old, careful research. There's a reason I chose you, specifically, to plant that letter beside, he said, eyes on Issa. It wasn't only your father's name. My family kept records long, before it kept grudges. Records of a bloodline the old crown once hunted, generations back, because it carried something dangerous. Something that could calm the maddest alpha alive, with nothing more than a scent. His smile came back, thinner now. Your mother's people. I wondered, when I first heard the rumors of a servant girl taming the king, whether the old stories were finally proving true. It seems they were. Which was the part of the story that changed everything Issa thought she understood. Because it meant this had never been random. Because it meant two families, two old wounds, one born of a soldier's testimony, and one born of an ancient, hunted bloodline, had been quietly bleeding into each other for longer than either she or Kailyn had been alive, and she had simply been the newest thread pulled taut between them, guilty in Draven's eyes twice over. Once for the sins of a father she barely remembered. Once for the blood of a mother, who had spent her whole life hiding exactly this. You could have come to him, she said. Voice shaking, but steady underneath the shake. Asked for justice. A trial. Something that didn't require poisoning a man slowly, until his own mind turned against him. Justice. Draven's smile came back, thin and cold now instead of warm. Justice is a story powerful men tell themselves, so they can sleep at night. I stopped believing in it the day they buried my father in an unmarked grave. His hand came out of his coat. Not a weapon. A talisman. Small, dark, pulsing faintly with a sickly violet light, that made the air around it feel thinner somehow, colder, wrong in a way Issa's body understood, before her mind caught up. Enjoy your light, Draven said. It's the last thing either of you is going to see, before the dark takes what's owed. He moved fast. Faster than a man his size should have been able to move, closing the distance, and closing his hand around Issa's arm, before Kailyn could fully process the threat, dragging her backward toward the tree lean, while the talisman pulsed brighter, angrier, feeding on something none of them could name. Let her go, Kailyn roared. But the sound that tore out of him next wasn't a king's command. It was the beast. Because whatever restraint he'd clawed back, over the last few weeks, whatever fragile control Issa's presence had rebuilt in him, it shattered the instant her scream cut through the dark, replaced by something older, something that answered only to a single instinct. Protect. He crossed the courtyard in a blur, wolf and man merging, into one single, furious purpose, and the blow that caught Draven sent him sprawling across the frozen cobblestones, the talisman skittering from his grip and shattering against the stone in a burst of violet light that split the night wide open. The shockwave hit like a physical thing. Kailyn staggered, his massive frame convulsing, as whatever dark weight had been pressing on his mind for a year finally, violently, let go. The fog didn't fade this time. It was torn away, all at once, leaving him gasping on his knees in the courtyard, blinded and disoriented by the sudden, brutal return of his own clear mind. Draven scrambled up from the stones. Face twisted now, all pretense gone, nothing left but raw, cornered fury. He drew a blade from his boot. And lunged. The guards reached him a half-second, before the blade found its mark. Captain Bren led them, half a dozen men pouring, through the shattered gate, tackling Draven mid-lunge, and driving him hard, into the frozen ground. The dagger clattered uselessly across the cobblestones. Within seconds they had him pinned, wrists bound in the very iron that had once held their king captive to his own madness. Take him to the deepest cell, Bren barked. Alive. The king will want him to answer for this properly. Draven thrashed, screamed something incoherent about debts, and justice and dead fathers, and then the guards hauled him away, into the dark, and the courtyard fell, finally, into a silence, so complete it felt like the whole castle was holding its breath. Issa stood frozen. Watching Kailyn kneel there in the frost, chest heaving, the fog gone, from his eyes for the first time in, over a year, and something cold, and terrible settled, into her chest, that had nothing to do, with Draven at all. Because if the curse was broken. Because if he didn't need her anymore to hold back the madness. Then whatever strange, unexplainable bond had drawn them together might simply vanish. Along with it. She was just a maid again. Ordinary. Replaceable. Kailyn lifted his head. His eyes found hers. Clear. Steady. Nothing left of the desperate, fog-blurred hunger, from that first terrible night in the dark. Just him. He rose slowly. No urgency in it now, no desperation, something else entirely, something that looked, as he crossed the courtyard toward her, almost like certainty. Issa. He said her name plainly, no hesitation in it this time. You're wondering if this changes things. If what we had was only ever the fog speaking. She lowered her eyes. Braced for the words she'd spent her whole life expecting. I understand, Your Majesty, she whispered. You're free now. I am. He tilted her chin up, with two gentle fingers, until she had no choice, but to meet his eyes. But I am not free of you. I fought monsters for a year, he said. Fought the rot inside my own mind. Fought to keep a throne, that was slipping, through my fingers along, with my sanity. His voice dropped, low and reverent, the words landing slow, and deliberate, like a vow. And in all of it, you were the only thing, that made the world worth staying awake for. He pressed his forehead to hers. You were my light, when I had nothing else, he murmured. Now that I can finally see clearly, I choose you. Not because I have to. Because I want to. Every day, for the rest of however long we're given. He didn't hide her after that. Didn't shy away, from what the court would say, what the whispers would become by morning. He turned toward the great hall, where lit windows already showed frightened, curious faces pressed close to the glass, and he pulled Issa against his side, and he walked her straight, into the center of the gathered court like a man, with nothing left to explain, and nothing left to fear. The whispers died the moment they crossed the threshold. Every noble who had once called her a mouse. Every lady who'd hidden a smirk behind a lace fan. Every voice that had spent weeks deciding, quietly, that she was a threat to be managed, or a joke to be endured, all of it went silent under the weight of what they were watching. The curse is broken, Kailyn announced. Voice ringing off the rafters, filling every corner of the hall. And the man responsible for it sits in chains tonight, awaiting judgment. He turned to face Issa fully. But there is something else the court should know, he said. Something I should have said the very first night she walked into my darkness, and refused to run. He leaned down. Buried his face against the curve of her neck, breathed in the scent that had saved him 100 times, over the past weeks, wild mint and rain-washed earth, and pressed his teeth, gently, deliberately, into the soft skin of her shoulder. The mating bite. Public. Irrevocable. A declaration no council, no ancient grudge, no forged letter could ever unwrite. Issa is my Luna, he announced, voice thick with something that sounded, for the first time, that anyone in that hall could remember, entirely unguarded. My mate. My equal. And my queen, until the stars fall. The court sank to its knees. All of them. Every lady with a lace fan, every lord who'd whispered behind her back, every voice that had once decided she was small enough to discard. Issa didn't look at them. She looked at Kailyn. At the man, who had traded every ounce of pride a king was supposed to carry for a chance to kneel in frozen mud, and beg a servant girl not to leave him. And she understood, standing there in front of the whole trembling court, that she had never once needed their approval. She only needed his truth. And she finally had it. The trial began 3 days later. Kailyn had insisted on that. Not an execution carried out quietly in some forgotten cell, not vengeance dressed up as justice, but a public reckoning, held in the same great hall, where he'd claimed her, where every noble, who had ever underestimated her would be forced to sit, and listen to exactly how far the rot in their own court had spread. Draven stood before the assembled council in chains, and when Oren finally presented the full weight of what he'd uncovered, the shipping manifests, the shell accounts, the raven seal traced back, through 2 generations of quiet, patient grievance, the old family records detailing a bloodline the crown had once hunted, something worse than Draven's guilt came to light. Names. Council members who had known. Who had looked the other way, or worse, quietly funded the slow poisoning of their own king, because a mad monarch was easier to manipulate than a sane one. The rot had never belonged to one man alone. It belonged to an entire generation of quiet complicity, and Kailyn, watching it unravel in front of him, understood that breaking the curse had only been the beginning. The kingdom itself needed healing now. And this time, he intended to do it, with his eyes open. The night before the trial's final session, Oren visited the deepest cell. Not out of mercy. Out of the same stubborn need for understanding, that had driven him, through ledgers and shipping manifests for weeks on end. Why now? Oren asked. You could have waited. Struck when the king was weaker. Why move the moment the girl arrived? Draven laughed. Hollow. Tired. Because I watched her walk into that room expecting to die, he said. And I thought, good. One less loose thread. A pause, longer than it needed to be. Except she didn't die. She fixed him. And every day she stayed, my father's death meant less, and less to anyone but me. So you decided to remove her instead. I decided, Draven said quietly, that if I couldn't have justice, I would at least have an ending. Any ending. Even a bad one felt better than watching the world move on like my father never existed at all. Oren studied him a long moment. Your father was wronged, he said finally. I've read the old records. The accusation against him was thin. Political, more than proven. A pause. But you let that wrong become the excuse for 100 worse ones. You poisoned an innocent man's mind. You would have destroyed an innocent girl's life, twice over, for her father's testimony, and her mother's blood alike. Grief doesn't grant a man the right to become the very thing that hurt him. Draven said nothing to that. Because there was nothing left to say. The trial itself lasted 3 long days. Kailyn sat at the head of the council table, crown on, spine straight, and made himself listen to every piece of evidence Oren laid out, without once looking away, even when the names started coming. Even when the rot turned out to run deeper into his own council than any of them had wanted to believe. Lord Halden, who had quietly redirected funds through the trading house for over a year, claiming ignorance until the ledgers proved otherwise. Lady Corvin, distant cousin to Draven's fallen house, who had passed information from inside the palace walls in exchange for a promise of restored standing once the throne changed hands. 2 more names after that. Then a third. By the second day, half the council chamber sat in stunned silence, watching men and women they'd shared tables with for years being led away in chains meant for traitors, not nobles. "How deep does it go?" Kailyn asked Oren quietly, during a brief recess, his voice low enough that only the old steward could hear it. "Deeper than I feared," Oren admitted. "This wasn't one man's grievance, sire. It was a fracture that's been spreading through this court for years. Draven simply found the crack, and knew exactly how to widen it." Kailyn closed his eyes. "Then we don't just punish him," he said. "We rebuild what let him succeed in the first place." Issa testified on the final day. She hadn't wanted to. Standing in front of the same court that had once sent her to what they assumed would be her death, recounting every soft word Draven had offered her, every carefully placed doubt, every forged letter designed to break something fragile, before it had the chance to become strong. But she did it anyway. Because her father's name had been dragged through that hall as an excuse for cruelty, and her mother's silence had been dragged through it too, both of them made into justification for a plot neither of them had any part in choosing. She was the only one left who could speak for the truth of who they'd actually been. Not villains in someone else's grief, but 2 ordinary, frightened people who'd tried, in their own quiet ways, to protect a daughter from a debt that was never hers to carry. "My father is not here to defend himself," she said, voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Neither is my mother. But I am. And I will not let their names, their choices, or their blood be the justification for what was done to an innocent man's mind, or nearly done to me." The hall was silent when she finished. Even Draven, chained at the center of it all, looked away first. The sentence came down on the evening of the 3rd day. Not execution. Kailyn had been firm on that point from the start, over the objections of council members, who wanted a swifter, bloodier ending to the whole affair. Exile instead. Stripped of what remained of his family's name, sent beyond the borders, with nothing but the clothes on his back, a mercy Draven hadn't extended to anyone else, and one Kailyn offered anyway, because he understood, better than most in that hall, what it meant to be nearly consumed by something you never chose. "You will live," Kailyn told him, standing over the chained man one final time. "But you will live with what you did. Every day, for the rest of your life, out there in the cold, with nothing left to blame, but the choices you made." Draven said nothing. There was, finally, nothing left worth saying. Winter turned slowly toward spring after that. The council chamber filled with new faces, some old names restored to honesty, some new voices given seats they'd earned rather than schemed for. Oren oversaw most of it personally, tired but satisfied in a way he hadn't been in years, the quiet vindication of a man who'd spent 3 reigns learning exactly how patience could outlast even the most careful corruption. Issa stood beside Kailyn, through every long council session, every difficult decision, every slow rebuilding of trust between a throne and the people it was meant to serve. Not because a curse demanded her presence. Because she'd chosen, freely, to stay. On a clear morning in early spring, she found, at last, the courage to ask Oren the question she'd been carrying since that first sleepless night by her narrow window. What her mother's crescent symbol truly meant, and why it had waited generations to matter again. Oren brought her, that afternoon, into the deepest part of the archive, past shelves of records even he rarely disturbed, and showed her a single, brittle page describing an old bloodline the crown had once feared enough to scatter across the realm rather than let it remain in one place. A bloodline whose scent alone could steady the wildest alpha mind. Persecuted, generations back, not for any crime, but simply for the danger its very existence posed to anyone who might wish to control a king, through madness instead of loyalty. Your mother wasn't hiding shame, Oren told her gently. She was hiding you. From exactly the kind of man who found you anyway. Issa held the old page in her hands, feeling, for the first time, like a question she had carried her whole life had finally found its answer. She did not need it anymore, not really. Kailyn had already told her, in his own way, that her worth had never depended on old bloodlines, or old debts. But understanding where she came from settled something in her chest all the same, a quiet homecoming she hadn't known she was still waiting for. That evening, standing together at the same high window, where a lonely king had once watched candlelight burn late into the night, wondering whether the girl who'd saved him would ever truly believe she was worth staying for, Kailyn found her there, with the old page still folded in her hand. You found it, he said. Not a question. My mother's people, she said quietly. They were hunted for what they carried. Not for anything they did. Just for what they were. And yet here you stand, Kailyn said, not hidden, not hunted, not afraid. The last of a bloodline the old world tried to erase, and the first thing this kingdom will remember, when they speak of the winter the king came back to himself. Issa looked out at the courtyard below, quiet now under a thin dusting of late frost, the same ground, where a king had once knelt in the mud, and refused to let her walk away. I used to think surviving was the only thing I was good for, she said. Small mercies. That's what my mother called it. And now? She turned to face him, and for the first time in her life, the words came, without hesitation, without bracing herself for the ground to shift beneath them. Now I think I was made for more than surviving, she said. I think I was made to be found. Kailyn reached for her hand, and this time neither of them flinched at the weight of what that simple gesture meant, a king and a girl the world had once tried to erase, standing together at a window, where the light, finally, had nowhere left to hide.